The avatar state has always been one of the most interesting aspects of the bending system to me. On one hand, it's this simple stop-all solution to just about any problem, because, well, you know, it's like thousands of years worth of experience. I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this whole mastering the elements business is a waste of time, and the only thing Aang should have mastered is the avatar states. But on the other hand, we pretty quickly learned that the stat requirements, if you will, for the avatar state are maybe a little bit too high, and using it, well, is maybe just a bit too risky. Before we get properly stuck in all the conversations about how Aang uses the avatar states, I think a good starting point is to first define what it even is. Most commonly, we just see it as ultra OP bending, but really, it takes on multiple different forms. The one we see most often with Aang is a purely reactionary protection mechanism and letting Raava take the wheel, be it from physical or mental threats. Though even with this, there are varying degrees of control. In some instances, it is simply unbridled rage, while in others, Aang can still talk even while already in his glowy mode.
Tell me where Arwen is!
This is the primary kind of avatar state we'll be talking about throughout the series, so let's leave this point for now. Another way we see the avatar state used is for a temporary but fully conscious power-up. During the Roku flashback, for example, we see him momentarily tap into the avatar state and wipe out Sozin's throne room in the Earth Kingdom colony. Ditto for Aang momentarily popping the avatar state to set out the fires after defeating Ozai. More on that later though. That's basically what I think of as a fully realized avatar. One capable of drawing on the millennia of experience without succumbing to that great power themselves. But even above all of that, we have the single most powerful form of the avatar states, merging with other spirits themselves. This is something that we've only ever seen once in the Northern Water Tribe, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that it is easily the most powerful form an avatar can take, with it quite literally being the merging of two primordial beings. But importantly, despite there being these different forms of the avatar state, the single universal truth is that it is insanely powerful. Be it just the unbridled rage from the avatar themselves, or two separate spirits working in conjunction, it is a force of nature, with, again, seemingly very little downside. One thing I absolutely love in fantasy, where you have these kind of chosen ones or select people with a unique ability, are the political implications of that power. In the Thrones universe, for example, George has likened dragons to a nuclear deterrent, because, well, both are ridiculously destructive powers that simply make conflict too costly. This might sound a little goofy to talk about in the context of Avatar, but we have actually seen various forms of exactly this in both Aang's story as well as the extended universe. A lot of Kyoshi's story, for example, is all about these different factions of the Earth Kingdom trying to mold her into a specific kind of avatar to suit their political needs. In the Promise comics, why does it sound so weird? I've recorded this line like 10 times. But we have the entire Harmony restoration movement and the question of how do we remove these Fire Nation colonies from the Earth Kingdom? This time, it's not so much Aang being used as a weapon or a sort of a deterrence for any given side, but rather by him choosing a side, the other one would basically just have to comply. And looping back to the main series, Sozin and Roku are also exactly this. During Sozin's reign, he tried pitching his whole imperialism plan to Roku, who, you know, promptly shut it down. And as long as Roku was alive, there was never any large-scale war. Sozin did try poking Roku, but well, we all know how that ended.
12 seconds later.
Single step out of line will result in your permanent end.
It's only after his death that Sozin launched his full-scale offensive that we see in the series. Something we will almost certainly learn more about in the upcoming Roku novel. Please, someone greenlight a full Sozin series. Imagine dragons being used in war and people hunting down dragons like it would literally be Game of Thrones level. This time, unironically, it would be so cool. Even with Aang and General Fong, it's basically the same thing, only slightly different. His perspective on the Avatar state is the almost naive, oh, it's just straight up OP, so let's go and take out the Fire Lord like right now. He completely ignores the potential consequences and risks involved, and simply opts for the nuke it approach. So on top of the Avatar state just being a massively juiced up form of bending, there is also that messaging angle of it just being horrifying to witness. An avatar by themselves is still just a normal bender. Sure, they may use all 4 elements, but it's still just one person. An avatar in the avatar state, on the other hand, well, that is an uncontainable force of destruction that you most certainly don't want as an opponent. So looping back to Aang's story, I think his progression with the avatar state very much reflects his headspace and really how he views the rest of the elements. Right at the start of Book 1, we see him pop the avatar state to fight off Zuko's forces. Well, obviously it's not Aang using the Avatar state, it's just the Avatar state kicking in, but you get the idea. The bending he uses there was definitely impressive for its time, but really, it's just a quick safety switch rather than overwhelming power as we'd see later in the series. The Aang we see at the start has barely regained his footing after being gone for 100 years and is also still just an airbender. And so I think his first Avatar state, being this relatively tame and reactionary move, is very fitting. He does the bare minimum to make sure he is safe and only ever uses waterbending that might actually pass for airbending. So yeah, old Baldy and Rava still hadn't quite woken up from their long nap. The Southern Air Temple though, well, that is a very, very different story. As much as I joke about Aang still being sleepy when he was fighting Zuko, emotions obviously have a huge effect on the Avatar states. With Zuko, Aang made it pretty clear that he doesn't actually see him as a threat.
Well, you're just a teenager.
And so, his Avatar state there is also relatively muted. But when he sees Gyatso, his subconscious doesn't know how to respond because it's death. The Avatar state rushes in to defend him, but Aang has no gauge of what he's even fighting, and so it just goes into overdrive. There is nothing to fight, it is just unbridled rage aimed at the entire world. What I find most interesting here though, and this is almost certainly just a creative decision, is that Aang only uses airbending, or in other words, just his absolute closest elements. Even in this moment of completely uncontrolled emotions, Aang is contracting inward. He has thousands of years worth of experience with every single element, yet the only thing he does is conjure a massive air sphere to push everything and everyone away. He doesn't start spewing out fire or sending out earthquakes, it is just air. But okay, that is definitely overanalyzing. During the winter solstice, we see a slightly different spin on the Avatar state, both in terms of how it is portrayed as well as its power. This time, it's not just a whoopsie button for Aang. This time, it is specifically Roku taking the wheel while also imbuing Aang with a whole lot of wisdom. We are already moving away from just a simple power-up to the much more spiritual and mystical Avatar state that we see throughout the rest of the series. In an abstract sense, we know that the Avatar state pulls on his past lives. But I think with this actually being Roku's form, it really solidifies that idea of this being an ancient power in which Aang's role is tiny. We'd see this on full display with the Siege of the North, but implicitly, it is already beginning to show us that the story we are following is but a blip in history. Both Aang and Roku, even with more than a century between them, might as well be one and the same. Ditto for the Jongjong scene. Taking the grand story that we are following and making it tiny, and then introducing this whole cosmic angle to everything is just a very efficient form of world building. And the best part, there doesn't actually have to be more story. You've implied that there is a long history and this whole transcendental realm and everything else. Naturally, people want to fill in the gaps themselves. But with that, let's jump on over to the Northern Water Tribe. Even before we get to the Koizilla, the angle of the spirit world, being this abstract plane of existence where time itself becomes wonky, is already pushed at the forefront with Ko and his relationship with the Avatar. Again, just like with the Solstice and just like with Jongjong, Aang is Roku, Roku is Kyoshi, Kyoshi is Kuruk. In the Avatar state, they are one and the same. When you combine this with all the avatars we saw in the Southern Air Temple, suddenly the whole Avatar cycle is this super mystical thing that you can't help but wonder about. But much more importantly, after Zhao, the unhinged Moonslayer man, well, slays the moon, we see Aang become one with the ocean itself. Thus far, we had seen the Avatar state as just a power-up. We had seen the bizarreness of the spirit world and the connective thread between all the avatars. But here, we really see what it means to be the bridge between the human world and the spirit world. The Avatar isn't just capable of passing over or peering into it, people like Iroh could do the same thing. The Avatar is capable of bringing the spirit world itself into the human realm. He can become a vessel not just for all the avatars that came before him, but other primordial spirits to restore balance on a cosmic scale. This isn't rage. This is absolute judgment from something so old and so powerful that the waterbenders just fall to their knees and bow in awe of this being. Much like with Roku, Aang allows himself to simply become the conduit for this unimaginable power. This Aang is already a waterbender, and so he simply goes with the flow. He allows Law to guide his movements to the ocean's wishes. So in the Book 1 narrative, the Avatar state is basically invulnerable. It brings power, it brings wisdom and spirit beyond anything any normal human could comprehend. It transcends bending, it transcends time, and it even transcends the earthly plane itself. But most importantly, Aang is never the driver. Which brings us onto Book 2, where, just like the rest of the story, the Avatar state also becomes a whole lot more complex. I think it is a very deliberate decision to have the Koizilla immediately preceded by General Fong, as it very bluntly answers the question of, why doesn't Aang just use the Avatar state, like right now, to defeat Ozai? We see all of those political implications with Fong that we already talked about. But importantly, it also shows us that the Avatar state is not a force to be trifled with. It is a defense mechanism designed to protect the Avatar, sure, but it is also an otherworldly weapon that no one, including Aang, understands. You know, just putting it out there, but I think trying to force out a 10,000-year-old spirit is probably not a good idea. And so, the Avatar state goes from being just powerful to wrath. Even when Aang is told that no one is actually in danger, he cannot stop. The Avatar state is no longer just a protection mechanism that will turn off as soon as the problem is solved. No, it is Aang's boiling hatred manifested like a thousandfold. And on top of that, we learn that the Avatar state also turns Aang into a glass cannon. So even if we were to artificially push him into the Avatar state and have him go against Ozai, one solid hit and the Avatar is gone for good. This is of course a massive Chekhov's gun, but it immediately dismantles any sort of grand plan as using the Avatar state as just a simple weapon. Even if there was a 99% chance that Aang would defeat Ozai, the risk of losing the Avatar altogether just isn't worth it. And even more so, Aang himself becomes afraid of its devastating power. So not only is it just a glass cannon fueled purely by his subconscious, Aang's conscious mind will now do everything in its power to repress it. Obviously, mastering something that you have a almost fear against is next to impossible. And so the Avatar state becomes a far-off thing, just like firebending. Both are simply too destructive for a monk worldview. Both are things he cannot control, both only consume and destroy. Both have harmed so many people, and so he forgets all about it. That is, until the desert. Just like Book 1 and him becoming Koizilla is, in my mind, a representation of Aang becoming a waterbender and going with the flow, the desert and the Avatar state bubbling up there I think is a representation of Aang's much more stable outlook on life post-earthbending. I've made a whole video on this, so big recommend watching that. But instead of losing control entirely as we'd seen before, this Aang stands his ground and demands answers.
Tell me where Armin is!
You can hear the fury in his voice, you can sense 1,000 lifetimes worth of rage about to snap, but he doesn't. For a good minute, he simply stands there, still in the Avatar state, and just listens. Eventually, he does lose control, and just like with Gyatso, conjures his big air sphere, but despite not really having an understanding of the Avatar states, Aang does exhibit a much stronger sense of self compared to his previous outbursts. And I think that is further strengthened by his reaction to Katara. Even when she goes to grab him, for that brief moment, his resolve is unwavering. That simmering rage doesn't go away. In the Southern Air Temple, Katara simply talked him down. Here, on the other hand, there is momentary doubt of what he's going to do. His head snapping to her is not one of recognition. It's the same rage-filled stare he gave the Sandbenders. And even as he finally begins to descend and his eyes quiver, his eyebrows are still furrowed, his eyes are pointed forward. Even though Aang is not in control anymore, his resolve is much stronger now that he is an earthbender, and so is the Avatar state. In my mind, I think this is a crucial step in his journey of accepting the Avatar states. Later in The Serpent's Pass, he'd talk about how he never wants to have his emotions flare up like that. But while I think there is a degree of trying to suppress them, I think there is an equal desire to manage them and channel them into what matters. The fear he once had for the Avatar states is now replaced with determination of getting it and his own emotions under control. Which finally takes us to the Guru and the Crossroads of Destiny. With the Guru, despite Aang's now much more balanced worldview and perspective on his Avatar duties, he doesn't wish to let Katara go, which of course then translates into him not being able to open the final chakra, and not being able to use the Avatar state during the fight in the Crystal Catacombs. But before we get to the actual catacombs, the celestial imagery we see with the Guru, I think again, very neatly puts in perspective how otherworldly the power of the Avatar really is. Sort of like we see in the swamp with everything being connected, it goes way beyond just raw strength. It really is this almost higher form of being with a completely different perspective on the world, almost akin to the Maiar in the Tolkienverse. Wait, actually, the Avatar is a sort of a Maiar because, you know, a spirit meant to fight the darkness? Wizards aside though, we already know that celestial bodies affect bending, be it the moon and waterbenders or the sun and the firebenders. So I think this sort of abstract representation of him walking this narrow path of destiny is excellent. And also, note the use of purple here. Historically, purple, or more specifically purpure, has been associated with royalty, great status, and so on simply due to its rarity. There just aren't a lot of purple things, so it was a cool color. The great power and status obviously fits the Avatar. And in fantasy, you'll also see that purple is used for either A, corruption, or B, some sort of super special magic. And while there is a lot to be said about all of those potential stylistic choices, what to me is the single most interesting thing is that purple, well, purple doesn't exist.
Hey, Vsauce! Michael here.
Obligatory, I am not a physicist. The color purple is not represented by a particular wavelength of visible light. It is entirely made up in our brains. Whenever you're seeing purple, your brain is actually thinking, oh, okay, so that is blue and that is red, but it's definitely not green. Because in order for purple to be perceived, there needs to be an absence of green light. But okay, fun science fact aside, I think using the color that doesn't actually exist to represent the mystical and otherworldly plane that is Cosmic Aang almost subconsciously creates this sense of something grander. Something that is beyond our understanding, which I think is just very fitting for the Avatar. But returning to the story, Book 2 very much takes us full circle, only like the opposite. Where it opened with an uncertain Aang being pushed into the Avatar state and causing untold destruction, it ends with a much more confident Aang choosing to go into the Avatar state, but being brought down in the space of a few seconds. For the first ever time in the series, it was actually Aang at the wheel. There was no Rage, no Roku, and no Moon Spirit holding his hand. It was actually Aang ready to use the Avatar state. But he still gets punished because he was not resolute. Had he opened his final chakra and popped the Avatar state right from the get-go, chances are this fight would have gone very, very differently. But even in spite of him facing the fear of that power, there are still quite a few more internal struggles that he has to deal with. Azula very plainly shows why the Avatar state is not to be used lightly and why not using it is probably the better option. If the wielder is not hard set on exactly what they're going to do, then those 1,000 lifetimes of experience mean absolutely nothing and all you are is a glass cannon. And for that exact reason, following his now second death, Aang does not enter the Avatar states right up until Ozai and largely being forced into it. He can go with the flow and adapt like a waterbender, he can be stoic like an earthbender. But what he can't quite do just yet is truly channel that all-consuming power that is the Avatar state and fire. Full video on Aang and firebending coming soon TM, but it's through him reshaping his perspective on fire that I think his bending philosophy in the Avatar state also begins to shift. Fire can be destructive and it can consume, but the only person who can choose how to use it is the bender. There is life within the flame, a life that needs to be nurtured and cared for, just like Zhang taught Aang way back when. He didn't hear that message originally, and that got Katara burned. But now, having learned the true meaning of fire, he is more aggressive with the element, but really, he is more reserved. He doesn't mess around with it or joke around with it anymore because he knows how dangerous the element is. He no longer fears it, but he knows that it is a force not to be trifled with. And so, when we get to Aang's fight against Ozai and things are looking incredibly dire, a massive shout out to Lil Spiky Rockboy by the way, Aang allows himself to slip into that rage. He roars and blasts apart everything that Ozai throws at him, but not for a second does he let go of control. If you allow me to slip in a quick line from Arsonist's Lullaby, don't you ever tame your demons, but always keep them on a leash. That is Aang in the Avatar states. He was, and to at least some degree, probably is still afraid of it. We have seen the sheer breadth of destruction this thing can cause, but Aang never lets it take over, as opposed to Ozai, Azula, and even Hama. All three were juiced up by external powers that they simply relied on too much. They didn't keep those demons on a leash, and it tore them apart. The Aang we see at the end of Book 3 is an airbender wanting to protect his opponents. He is a waterbender adapting to any situation. He is an earthbender standing firm in the face of all adversity. And most importantly for the Avatar state, he is a Firebender, knowing full well how destructive and uncontainable the element is. For a good little while there, Ozai was winning and giving Aang a very nice little sauna. One zap of lightning and Aang would have been cooked, but he slipped too far into that overwhelming power and was eventually beaten back by an also juiced up bender, but one who was fully in control. Right up until Aang takes away Ozai's bending, his spirit stands firm, absolutely certain of its capabilities, certain of its limits, and certain of itself. And so, very fittingly, Aang's final act of bending is a momentary flash of the Avatar state as he sets out the fires. He puts an end to the boiling hatred that had been consuming the Earth for over a century. This is a fully realized Avatar. At the end of the day, the Avatar state is always a big red button to press in case of emergencies. Even against Ozai, it is a defense mechanism first and offense later. But importantly, it is never a one-stop solution. Without Aang's training in the other bending forms, despite the experience of 1,000 lifetimes, the Avatar state is still fragile. He can channel past avatars through his body, but unless it is a specific temple under specific circumstances, it will always be just his body. The journey to mastering the Avatar state is as much about internal balance as it is about external control, both of which can be very, very messy at times. Ozai's defeat is the encapsulation of all of these things. He is brought down by the unbridled rage of the Avatar states. That impregnable safety mechanism now turned into devastating offense. But eventually, Aang pulls back. With every single move Aang throws in the Avatar state, there is a battle going on in his own body, constantly trying to hold on to control. And so, that quote-unquote simple power-up falls away as Aang consciously chooses to give it up. And of course, Aang taking away Ozai's bending is just that very blatantly visualized. It is no longer a battle fought on just a battlefield, but one within their own spirits. Ozai slipped, allowing that crimson to take over, pushing and pushing to the edge of victory. But unlike Aang, his spirit was not firm. It burned and burned and burned until all that was left was ashes. And that's the video. Another one I've been meaning to make for a little while now, and another one that may or may not have resulted in 3 more video scripts already in the drafts. I mean, what can I say? Avatar is just that good. And also, quick note for those of you still checking in on the live action version, I'm covering all the news as they come out on my second channel, so give that a look if you're interested. A few positive developments have already come out to address some of my main criticisms of Book 1, so that's pretty cool. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team, Mythic 916, Tony Hugh, and Paul Dixon. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!